Been a little while since I got to bust this out. Ghostbusters Afterlife. So, I've now seen it, and I should probably talk a little bit about the mindset that I went into this with before we get too far into it. I am literally a lifelong fan of the original Ghostbusters. It came out when I was 2. I didn't see it when I was 2. I don't know how old I was. I couldn't have been older than 5. That's the oldest I could have possibly been when I saw it for the first time. Ghostbusters is to this day my favorite movie of all time. And keep in mind, favorite doesn't mean I think it's absolutely perfect in every way. I do, but I'm not actually going to make that as an argument. It's the movie that I love more than anything else. I kind of hate Ghostbusters 2. I did an entire video not only talking about its problems, but how I would solve them. I was just very meh on the reboot. I thought there was some potential there. I liked more things than I thought I was going to like about it, but ultimately it felt like a kind of a nothing in the end. So I did not know what to expect of this. I was hopeful, but it would probably be a step too far to say that I was genuinely excited. I had a lot of reasons to be nervous. Now, I think it was probably a good idea that we got Jason Reitman to direct this one instead of Ivan Reitman, who directed the first 2. Because, here's the thing about both Ghostbusters 2 and the 2016 Ghostbusters. I feel like in both cases, they were made by people who did not fully understand why the first one worked. And yes, I'm including the fact that the people who made the second one were the people who made the first one. I still don't think they fully understood why it landed with the audience that it did, particularly those of us who were younger than the original intended audience. It wasn't made to be a kids' film. I mean, the 80s was a weird time where kids or family movies was a way more nebulous concept, but it wasn't aimed at kids, but it appealed to us, and both sequels failed to understand why that particular audience loved it, and they went in with the wrong mindsets, I think. This one being made by Ivan Reitman's son, who is a very good director in his own right, and who, like me, is also a lifelong fan of this. He is somebody who, okay, look, I don't want to say that elevating a fan of something to overtake the property is always going to work out. It's not. Things can get really self-indulgent and headcanon-y and fan-wanky, and, it can go bad. But if you get a skilled filmmaker who understands both their nostalgia for something and also can look past that to the more quantitative qualities of the thing, like Jason Reitman appears to have been able to do, you can get something that's actually kind of special. So in short, I had a great time with this movie. It's easily, it's not even close, my second favorite of the films. If I were to say, complete Ghostbusters thing, I think certain episodes of the Real Ghostbusters cartoon would probably just edge out this as my second favorite sort of stuff. Because, look, this is great, but I think I'm always going to kind of gravitate towards things like When Halloween Was Forever or Mr. Sandman, Dream Me a Dream. I've done multiple videos on that. I did one with my top 10, and I did a complete dissection of Mr. Sandman, Dream Me a Dream, which I argue is the best. But I feel like I'm quoting my bona fides as a fan too much. This thing, for the most part, was able to really well ride that line of giving me things that made my nostalgia tingle. So every time a music clip that I recognized from the first movie was played, I got a chill. Every time there was a shot that was reminiscent of something from the original, I got a chill, because these were actually really well deployed. Because the worst way to do this is to go way out of your way to draw attention to it, because the reason that never works is you are insulting the intelligence of the people who are getting your reference, and you're making it blatant to anyone who doesn't know the original work well enough to get the reference that they're missing something. When you go like, hey, look at this, remember the thing? People are either going to go, yeah, I know, I could tell without you pointing it out, or they're going to go, no, I don't remember the thing. What? So finding that balance of just integrating this stuff where it fits naturally, not only into the story, but into the flow of the film as a whole, that is not something to be taken lightly. And for the most part, this really does nail that. It also has a very good team dynamic. That was, I think, one of the failings of the 2016 Ghostbusters. Some of the characters were decent as individuals, but the overall team didn't feel very coherent and it didn't gel. And the personalities weren't they didn't have the chemistry that you wanted. Here, they do. Now, granted, part of that is sort of working off a cheat sheet because there are not all of them, but there are a number of characters who are kind of equivalent to a certain character from the original. So we have Phoebe, who is the Egon. We have Podcast, who is the Ray. We've got Trevor, who is the Venkman. And we don't, I mean, like, you could argue that there's another character who is the equivalent to Winston, but I don't think they're actually being built with the intention of them being that. And actually, there are more people in play that you could even sort of double count certain characters as sort of having more than one influence. But the build of this group, and like, here's the thing, these do feel like characters in their own right. It doesn't feel like the recreation of the original characters. It feels like having a new character who can fill a similar niche as a personality and as a part of a group chemistry dynamic, but who is not directly built to literally just be the same dang person, but just evokes the same kind of stuff. That's done really well. I'm going to get into spoilers eventually, but I felt good watching this. I was really afraid that I was going to feel pandered to in a very cheap way. I was afraid that I was just going to be like, okay, you basically remade it in a different setting. And like, can we talk about how it takes advantage of the rural setting? Because one of the things that's like kind of core to the original Ghostbusters is the fact that this is all happening in New York. Because as bustling and modern as New York is, it is an old city with old ghosts and old mysteries in it. And the idea of having these sort of ancient evils infesting such a modern city lent to the oddness, to the sense of unease. And this film recognizes that the unease that comes from a dilapidated, haunted farmhouse is a different kind of unease, and it manages to evoke that. So it doesn't feel like just transplanting everything to a different setting for the sake of a different view. It actually feels like it's impacted the way that things are shown. And this is like not major narrative stuff. This is just like the way the camera moves through things. Just the way things are built up. It feels like it has taken proper advantage to a different eerie setting than the original had. All the performances are good. Phoebe is amazing. She is such a good character, and I'm glad she is undeniably the lead of this. And this handles the fact that Harold Ramis was not alive to make this really, really well. And I was gonna not bring this up till later, but I can tell from my voice, you probably already guessed, I did cry during this movie several times for how things related to Egon were handled. It could have been so crass, but it's not. He is actually incredibly central to the plot of this thing. He's not present physically, because he can't be, but his spirit is at the heart of almost everything going on. And it feels like a celebration of Ghostbusters overall, but in particular of Harold Ramis. And I think it is incredibly fitting that the very first credit that rolls before anything else are just the words, "For Harold." This, I enjoyed a lot. I'm going to get into spoilers in a minute. So, my last broad overall thought. My one sort of niggling fear at the back of my head is that because this hit me just right in terms of the feel, the way the movie felt, I worry that if and when I see it again, and that initial hit to my nostalgia isn't as fresh, that I'll notice more flaws. I do worry about that. But for right now, on a single viewing, I like this a lot. There's a little bit of clunkiness in the third act, which I can't describe without getting into spoilers, so I have to save most of that. What I'll say is there are certain beats that feel a little bit obligatory. There is one particular moment that was cute but also didn't work for me, and there's a couple of beats towards the end that work but ride right up to the line of overstaying their welcome. But I thought this was a wonderful time. It felt really good to watch. I got to get into spoilers now. So if you haven't seen it and you want to, go. The rest of this video will be here when you come back. Okay, so the main thing I need to kind of talk about in a spoiler section is Gozer. Now, to some degree, maybe I didn't need to wait for spoilers to talk about Gozer. Gozer was teased incredibly heavily and basically shown in some of the later trailers. Now, the main reason I wanted to bring this up is that was actually my main point of concern. It really, like, I was worried about a Star Wars sequel trilogy effect, which is that bringing back the villain they beat in the movie I love runs the risk of negating that victory and making it not feel like they won. And I was worried about that. I was worried about just, does this thing not have any ideas of its own? Here's how they thread that needle and for the most part make it work. The first is, it's a completely valid point that their defeat of Gozer in the original was the closing of the doorway between dimensions, but Gozer still existed. So there's that. It doesn't have to undo or completely negate their victory. It's just picking up a thread that, well, you know, there is the possibility, and Gozer does in fact come back. The other thing is that because it's Gozer, it makes more sense that Egon went to the extremes that he went to in terms of abandoning his friends, his family, and just giving in to the fact that he was going to die alone because he knew, he had seen, he knew exactly what he was dealing with. Because I think it would have been a hard sell if all of this felt more theoretical, if it was a new threat and nobody believed him for that. I'm not saying that you couldn't have sold that, but it lands better for what they decided to have Egon's history be, for it to be a threat that he knows. Because if it's a threat you know, you are going to commit yourself that hard. This is not in theory. You know what this is. So that is part of why it works a lot better than I thought it would. It does lend itself to some of the issues in the third act. So, like, for example, the Keymaster and the Gatekeeper stuff, I kind of wish we could have gotten something, like, I don't think it would have been that hard to get a line in there basically saying this is not the exact same process that happened in New York. This is like a backdoor, so it works a little bit differently. And the reason I think that I kind of wish they did that is because while the Terror Dogs look great, and while the actors who get possessed do it well enough, it kind of speeds through those plot beats because there's no mystery anymore. We know Zool, Vince Glortho, we know how they work, we know what's going on here. So it kind of speed reads through that to get to Gozer, and it doesn't feel quite right because it is repeating the literal thing. It's one thing to repeat something in the vein of, like the ghost chase with the Muncher, which is effectively, it's Slimer all over again. It's their first capture, and as a ghost, he's very reminiscent of Slimer, but that's the thing. It is reminiscent of the thing without just being the same thing again. And unfortunately, Zool and Vince Glortho, the gatekeeper and keymaster, are kind of that. So that was one thing that didn't quite land right for me. I mentioned that there was a gag that was cute, but that I didn't like. And this is going to be stupid and nitpicky, but I'm going to do it anyway. So we have Ivo Shandor's body getting up, and it's played by J.K. Simmons, which was very good. Like, I laughed, but I laughed because of who it was, not because of the scene. I kind of hate the scene. Again, this is nitpicky, but let me vent. So, Ivo Shandor goes up to Gozer, says, "We could rule the world together." Gozer just rips him in half, which is what Gozer should do. But I kind of hate the scene because rule the world together? No. Ivo Shandor wanted to end the world, not rule it. Egon said in the first one that a big part of his motivation was that after the First World War, Shandor decided society was too sick to survive. He wasn't trying to rule the world. He thought people were terrible and should be destroyed. So that moment, I'm sorry, Jason Reitman, that's just wrong. You did it wrong. I don't think Ivo Shandor's physical presence in that scene adds anything anyway. It's like the one beat that just completely falls flat. Well, there's a little bit of cringe humor around Trevor and his crush. But, that was done fine. I just don't like that kind of humor. So I mentioned some things walk right up to the edge of outstaying their welcome, but do mostly still work. So that's the appearance of the 3 surviving Ghostbusters at the end, which I do think overall was handled well because they show up, they help. Their appearance and their presence does have an impact. It stops Gozer from that victory in that moment, but ultimately Gozer is can be said to be defeated by Phoebe more than any of them, which for this movie is what it should be. So it doesn't feel like it's dismissing the old guard, but it's also not letting them just come in and solve the problem. So that was well balanced, but there were just a few too many beats, a few too many jokes, or like, here's a core example. I was kind of honestly waiting, ever since Gozer showed up, for Gozer to say to somebody, "Are you a god?" And for them to say, "Yes," because Winston told Ray, when somebody asks you if you're God, you say yes. That is my favorite line from the entire movie. There's a lot of great lines in that movie. And they do it, and it's Ray, and I'm like, okay with that. But the fact that he doesn't just say yes, he pauses and lingers, and Winston and Venkman are like, oh, come on, right? Like, you killed it by extending a little bit. Just punch it up a little bit. So, like, that's kind of what I mean by they came very close to outstaying its welcome. And a little bit also with the appearance of Egon as a ghost. Now, when that hand first came around to support Phoebe, that was the first time I started crying. I got choked up earlier when Phoebe's mother was in the secret basement and saw all the pictures of her. But then, like, I started actively crying when his ghost showed up. And again, unfortunately, the moments that feel like they go on a little too long are tied to the original Ghostbusters. And I think that's the one part where Jason Reitman let the fanboy take over a little bit and override the director. Because, like, those shots just last a little too long. The jokes just go on a little longer than they should. So, like, when it's the lineup of the 4 of them and they have to each in turn, like, turn and look at Egon, it's a little too slow. It's a little too long. They did save it for me at the end with Egon, having his moments with Phoebe, Trevor, and then his daughter. And that's when I cried for the second time. So they pulled it back. But it's little things like that that keep it from being ideal. But I'll tell you what, if you're going to redo Gozer, which I would still argue is not necessarily the best idea, but if you're going to, you justify its use with the way that Egon was handled. And this is almost the best way you could have done it. I gave some minor tweak notes, but this is one of those cases where I'm going to say that was a well-executed thing that I would have said is a bad idea. And I'm still not entirely sure it wasn't a bad idea, but it was still well done. I like this a lot. Oh, I suppose I'll mention the little tiny Stay Puffs. They were fine. That also went on probably a little longer than it should have been. Overall, I like just simple tightening up of some beats. I'd probably shave about 5 minutes out of this movie in an edit if you let me in the editing suite on it. But it was good. And it felt really nice to go in and feel good watching a Ghostbusters movie in theaters again. Ghostbusters Afterlife. Have you seen it? What'd you think about it? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Like, share, subscribe. All help me out. I've got a Patreon, but you know how all that works. So I won't put too much pressure on you. Take a relaxed attitude around here, so just come on back next time you need a break. Hey, if you're sticking around through the credits, might as well hear some names read out. My Patreon helps support this, and in particular, I want to thank Raven McBain, Bookworm, MJ, Tracy Scrabbit, Vincent Paul Bartolucci, Kaylin Schwartz, Edalyn, Robin Moore, Ross Schultz, Shayla Gourlay. Want to hear me mispronounce your name? Check out the rewards on the Patreon.